Hey everyone, it's Ankylosaur. I hope you're all doing well. For today's video, I wanted to do a deep dive on the various counterspells one can find in competitive Pauper EDH, both to highlight the range of answers available to blue decks in the format, and also to give some insight into what your opponents might be holding up when they pass with 2 blue mana available, so that you might be able to play around their Countermagic a little bit easier. I decided to break the counterspells down by mana value, so that however much mana your opponents have, you can make educated guesses as to what answers they could have for your spells. I've only included the most popular counterspells in the format, so it's possible someone could still get you with a Hornswoggle out of nowhere. But for the most part, these are going to be the counters that you're most likely to encounter in CPDH. So with that out of the way, let's jump into the video. First up, we have the 2 quote-unquote free counterspells in the format. These can be cast with 0 lands untapped, and while they don't see a ton of play, you should be aware that they exist, just in case. The first is Legacy Staple Daze. This sees play primarily in the Simic combo decks, like Gretchen or Tatiova, where picking up a land isn't going to set them back as much as it might with other decks. I've also seen it out of Malcolm Red decks, especially those looking to combo off quickly, where soft countering an interaction piece for free might be all they need to win the game. The second free counter in the format is Foil. This one sees far less play, as its pitch cost of an island and another card is an incredibly steep price to pay. However, there are some combo decks that play this as well, like Disciple of Deceit, where it's both a way to protect one of their combo lines and a 4-drop they can discard to tutor up a combo piece like Archaeomancer. You aren't incredibly likely to run into a foil, but it does exist, and it is a hard counter, so it's a card to keep in the back of your mind against the heavily blue decks that can afford to discard an island at some point. Next, we have our 1-mana counters. The most important one in the whole format, I think, is Dispel. This is a hard counter for instants only, but instants are very powerful in the format, either as protection pieces, removal, or combo cards like High Tide or Ghostly Flicker. Almost every blue deck runs this card, as it's hands down the most efficient at what it does, so keep this one in mind as well when you're trying to Doomblade their commander or something. There's also Spell Pierce, which adds a little more flexibility in what it can counter, as it hits any non-creature spell, but it's a soft counter this time. This still sees quite a bit of play, as it can finish off a counter war for only 1 mana after a lot of interaction has been flung around and players are short of resources. But it is a tiny bit easier to play around if you have mana you can leave up so you won't get got. Next on the list is Intervene, a card that works both as a protection spell for the blue deck's own creatures and as a way to stop a combo piece like Freed from the Real or Wings of Valisfell. The flexibility of this card can be super brutal. Since CPDH is such a creature-centric format, being able to shut off interaction with those creatures for just 1 mana is huge, and a large percentage of blue decks are going to be running this one as well. I did want to note the difference between Intervene and similar-looking counters like Turn-Aside and Avoid Fate. Whereas Turn-Aside will protect not only your creatures, but also your other permanents, that is all that it does. Protect your things. Intervene, on the other hand, stops your opponents from interacting with their own creatures as well, and that makes all the difference. I've seen people have Turn-Aside sit in their hand while their opponent combos off, and had they been playing Intervene instead, they might have been able to stop the win attempt. So while Turn-Aside has niche uses, and Avoid Fate as well if you're not in blue, Intervene is almost always going to be the first version of this effect that you want to play. I also wanted to shout out Vines of Vastwood and Stave Off, which, while not technically counterspells, do a similar job to Intervene in most cases, saving your own creatures from removal while interfering with your opponent's win attempts that need to target their creatures. These are both excellent cards in non-blue decks, and I would 100% play them in Selesnya commanders like Satyr Enchanter or Kadira Caller of the Small, if those are strategies that interest you. Finally, I wanted to mention the blasts, Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. You won't find a more efficient, albeit narrow, counter/removal spell in the format, and it's great that red decks get some counterplay as well to the blue deck's stranglehold on stack interaction. Hydroblast and Blue Elemental Blast do exist as well, but with the prevalence of blue decks in the format compared to red decks, they don't see anywhere near as much play as Pyroblast, to the point that I don't think I've ever seen one of them cast in a game of CPDH. Next, let's talk about the real meat of the counterspells, and those are the 2-drops. Of course, we have to begin with the original, the actual factual counterspell. If you see 2 blue mana available, it's ingrained in our heads as Magic players to play around counterspell at this point, and for good reason. Basically, any base blue deck is going to be running this somewhere in the 99, and you'll need to decide if your spell is worth running into those 2 islands at some point or another during a game of CPDH. But there are other possibilities your opponent could be holding up as well, so let's take a look at some of those. The other counterspell that nearly every blue deck is going to be packing is Arcane Denial. Another hard counter, Arcane Denial lets you give your opponent 2 random cards in exchange for their best spell, which isn't a horrible trade. And Arcane Denial replaces itself for you as well, which is a large part of its appeal. It also has a secret secondary mode, which is counter my own spell, draw 3 cards at the beginning of the next upkeep, something that doesn't come up nearly as often as I think it should. Being able to trade an inconsequential spell, or a spell that's getting fizzled, for 3 whole new cards is incredible, and that flexibility is part of the reason Arcane Denial is as good as it is. And of course, almost every blue deck is also going to be running Negate. While it's useless against creatures, Negate is one of the best counters in the format because it hits absolutely everything else, and for only 1 blue and 1 generic mana, meaning its cost is less restrictive than even Counterspell itself. As a hard counter that deals with many of the scariest cards in the format, this is definitely a card to keep in mind as you try to develop your game plan, as you'll see it everywhere. Next, we have a couple hard counters that require a tiny bit of extra work in Deprive and Disruption Protocol. Deprive sees more play than Protocol, which requires a somewhat heavy artifact theme to really shine, but in a deck like Third Path Iconoclast, Disruption Protocol is basically Counterspell Part 2. Bouncing a land for Deprive is not a small cost, but again, in Simic decks like Gretchen, where putting extra lands into play is a huge part of the deck's strategy, the card fits right in, and is another efficient way to shut someone down. I also want to shout out Memory Lapse, which is both a hard counter and a big tempo play. Putting a spell on top of an opponent's deck that will be useless the next turn cycle is backbreaking, as it takes away their draw step as well as their spell. Plus, it only requires 1 colored mana, so it's easier to cast than something like actual factual counterspell. Next is Muddle the Mixture, which has its counterspell mode almost as a plan B. If a deck is running Muddle, it's almost always going to be for its transmutability, which allows you to search your library for any 2-drop and put it into your hand. However, it certainly counters instants and sorceries as well in a pinch, making it one of the best cards in the format in my opinion. I value flexibility very highly, and this is a card that not only grabs combo pieces out of your deck, but protects your combo as well if you need it to. Not every deck is going to be able to run it, because some just won't care about transmuting for something, but in the combo decks that want tutors, Muddle is fantastic. Finally, I have a bunch of somewhat more restrictive counters that are in the format and will show up from time to time, but are certainly more niche than the ones already listed. Flash Counter is a more expensive dispel. Not unplayable, but not something every deck is going to be in the market for. And Confound is a cantripping intervene, which I do like. Again, protection for you and disruption against your opponents. Keep Safe is the cantrip version of Turnaside, with the same problems I mentioned earlier about that card. And Dawn Charm, while usually used for its fog mode, can also, in a pinch, counter a big fireball pointed at your face. So that's good to keep in mind. There are a ton of other counters too. Soft counters like Miscalculation and Mana Leak, as well as Make Disappear, and the actually pretty good Lose Focus. And then Logic Knot, which I love and think should see a bit more play, especially if you're not using your graveyard for anything else. It's a soft counter, but when X can be like 7+, it's basically a hard counter for 2 mana plus some delving. CPDH also has a few counterspells that are playable at 3 or more mana. So let's take a quick look at those to finish out the video. First is Exclude, a spell that doesn't see a ton of play, but is a cantrip that can deal with someone's commander or the best creature that they have. I don't think it's bad in decks that can afford its 3 mana price tag. It is a 2 for 1, which is always something to keep an eye on in a multiplayer format, when trading 1 for 1 can really set you back. Next are a few cards that cost 3 up front, but might be as cheap as 2 mana or less, like Stoic Rebuttal and Ice Out. These are hard counters with a cost reduction if you have Metalcraft or want to bargain something, making them sort of a reverse disruption protocol. Again, in decks like Third Path Iconoclast, where Metalcraft is trivial and you have a bunch of tokens around to bargain away, these cards are excellent counterspells to run. There's also Metallic Rebuke, which is a soft counter, but one that can be cast for just 1 colored mana in the right deck, which makes it a pretty powerful option if you're overloaded on artifacts. Speaking of artifacts, any video on counters in CPDH wouldn't be complete without our one and only playable stifle, Mirror Shell Crab. Is the crab great? Not really. It very rarely gets played at competitive tables, but it's a unique effect for the format, and I've seen some amazing blowouts with it in high-powered casual games, so maybe it could use some reconsidering. Finally, we have the only 4-drop counter that makes the cut in CPDH, and that's Rewind. This only really sees play in decks like Gretchen, where you can load up a land with mana-producing auras, and then counter a spell to generate a bunch of mana by untapping that land. It's more of a ritual that way than it is a counter, but it's a good card to remember when playing against that particular flavor of Simic combo deck, because it can definitely lead to some disgusting turns. So, there you have my breakdown of Countermagic in competitive Pauper EDH. I hope you enjoyed this look at the various interaction the format has to offer, and if there are any counters you feel like I overlooked, please let me know in the comments, and we can continue the discussion there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Bye!